this part of the tutorial, we're going to implement the main functionality of the app. So far we've just created a lot of variables, and those variables are assigned values based on the inputs or outputs of the app so far, but we don't have any functionality going on, so that's what we'll do here. It's important to do more than just initialize variables in this app. So we're going to first initialize a button handle function, and that will call a calculate function, and that will call a print function. Welcome back. In this part we're going to implement the main functionality of this application. So right now we have declared and initialized handlers for all of the inputs and outputs that we're going to have happen during this app. So now we're going to actually do the main functionality and what will happen when the button's clicked. Now right now this text I have highlighted, this is a button handler. So we say button.click plus equals delegate, and then whatever's in these curly braces is what will happen once the button is pressed. However, this is inside of the main function that we're going to use, the onCreate function, and I find it easier if it's kind of broken into its own little function, so I'm just going to do that now. I'm going to get rid of this and put it in its own function. So this one's going to be a void return type, and we're going to call this button click. And so let's set it up. So I'm just going to paste that line that we had before. So I'm just kind of, again, putting this in its own function because, in my opinion, the functions shouldn't really do more than one or two tasks. So right now we have this function, and let's go ahead and call it. It's not doing anything, well, it's doing what we don't want it to do right now, but we'll fix that in just a second. So by calling it up here, we will ensure that whenever this code runs, the onCreate method runs, it will call button click and perform everything that's here. So our button is no longer called button, however, so we have to change this. Our button is called calculate button. So calculate button. And there we go. That's spelled properly now. So this ensures that when our calculate button is clicked, then it's going to do this. Now right now this is just changing the text of the button, which is not what we want. We want it to perform some kind of calculation. Now the calculation we'll have to put in another function, so I'm just going to leave this blank for now, and we'll go ahead and implement the other function, and then we can finish off doing this one. So let's create another function, and this will be calculate total cost, and it's again going to be a void, and it's not going to take in any parameters. So this is where the actual calculation is going to happen. What we can do is we can create a variable for the meal cost and a variable for the tip cost, and then perform the necessary calculations right in the function. So what we're going to do, rather than creating and assigning a cost just based on the code here, we're going to take the input and assign it. So we know that cost text, this variable, holds whatever will be in the input, the first input, and the tip text holds whatever will be in the second input. So what we can do here is we'll create a float, and the reason I choose a float instead of an integer is that it will have decimal places very likely, and integers can't handle decimal places. So we'll call this we'll just call it something simple like cost, and we're going to assign this the value. We're going to say float.parse, and we're going to pass it whatever text is in cost text. Now, this line may seem a little confusing, but it's really not that tough. So we're creating a float called cost, and what we're doing is we're passing it the text of this. So this is just our first input. So remember, if we go back to main, it will be whatever, when the app is run, it will be whatever we input in here. So this is a user input, and it's just the text form of that. And all this is doing, this float.parse, is converting this text into a float so that we can actually manipulate it. Because if it's still a string, then we will get errors when we try to handle it. So that's good. We have a float for cost. Let's do the same for tip. So we'll say tip, and again this will be float.parse, and we're going to pass it the tip text. Tip text.text. So again, same thing, it's just taking the text from the tip text input, and it's converting it to a float and storing it in this variable tip. Excellent. So now let's do some kind of math on it. So the tip that we'll be inputting will be a whole number, and it should represent a percent. So the way we do that is we divide it by 100. So for example, 40% should be converted to 0.40. So let's write the code for that now. So we'll say whatever tip used to be is going to be tip divided by 100. So now we have a decimal representation of our tip, and let's create another float. But this time we'll declare it as a global variable. So we'll call this float total cost. Okay, and I'll explain why well, in fact, I'll explain right now. The reason I declared total cost to be a global variable is because we'll be using it in a few different functions here. So if I only declare it in this function, the calculate total cost, I might need it later. And in fact, we're no longer using int count, so we can get rid of that. So if we scroll to the bottom, back down to our function, so we have our tip, and then we have our total cost should be equal to our cost plus our cost times the tip. Now this I'm just going to put in brackets to make sure that the order of operations run correctly. Now the reason I'm doing this is because the cost times the tip will give us the amount of the tip, because right now we're just passing in a tip percentage. So if we pass it the decimal representation of that percentage times the cost of, let's say, a meal or whatever it is that we're buying, then that will give us the total amount of the tip. That's a monetary value of the tip. And then we have to add it to the cost to display the total cost. So that's why we have cost plus cost times tip. Alright, so now we've calculated the total cost of the meal. So this is the cost of the meal, or whatever it is we're buying. I keep referring back to a meal because that's the simplest example. So we have the cost and of the meal itself, and then whatever the tip is going to be, which is going to be the tip percentage times the cost. Great. So now we've performed this calculation, and we want this calculation to occur every time that the button is pressed, because we have our two inputs, then we press the button, and then we get our output. So let's call this function in here, called calculate total cost. And this just ensures that when this function is called, the button click, as soon as the button is clicked, it will call this function, the calculate total cost, and it will calculate the cost. Now that's all well and good. We've had it calculating but not printing anything, which is why we need to make another function. So we're going to go down here, we're going to say void, and this is going to be, let's just call this print cost. We could do this all in one function, but again, I find it just helps make the code so much easier to read if a function is only performing one or two little tasks rather than one function doing many tasks. So all this is going to do is we're going to assign total cost text, and this is going to be equal to the total cost. In fact, this is not total cost text, this is total cost dot text. It's going to be equal to total cost to string. Now, this right here, in fact, this should be total cost text. I had it right before. So now this is saying the field total cost text.text. So if we go back to main, this is going to be this, because remember this is our total cost. So right now it doesn't really contain anything. So this just makes sure that the text portion of it will contain the total cost, and we're just going to convert it back to a string from a float, which is why we have the toString function here. So this is just going to populate the text of this with whatever the total cost is. So now we have a few things going on here. We have the onCreate. Once the onCreate method is called, onCreate function, then we'll run through it. We'll create these variables and assign them the values. So when we go to actually use the app and input something, we'll have this as a cost. That's going to be the first input. The tip is going to be the second input. We have the button that when pressed will do something, and then the total cost text will be whatever is spat out at the end. And then the onCreate function is going to call the button click function. And the button click function is going to say, well, whenever the button is clicked, we want to call the calculate total cost function. Then the calculate total cost function is going to convert the cost and the tip first to floats so we can work with them. Then it's going to calculate the total cost, and now we need to call print cost. So once it's calculated that, it will print the total cost, or rather it will convert it to a string and then populate the total cost text box with it. In this part of the tutorial, we implemented the main functionality of the app. So that's all the parts that actually do the calculation and the printing. So we started off by implementing first a button handle function, which, when a button was pressed, would call the calculate function, which would calculate our total cost, and then would change the text field to display that. So by now you should be able to implement basic functionality of these apps based on the inputs and outputs, and modify various text fields from the code itself.